invitation. It's really our pleasure and honor to have you here with us. And I really am very happy to host this event and also be able to be here with other inspiring people. So you have now, you can now start. I will mute myself. And if anyone has question, please write it directly to the chat. And by the end of the presentation, we have an open session of Q&A and also comment and sharing thoughts. Thank you very much for joining us again.
Well, thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. I am very privileged to be able to give this talk to you guys. And yes, I am very happy to answer questions at the end of the talk. I will probably limit my talk to about 40 minutes so that there is plenty of time. So I want to speak today about the work that I and my colleagues do at Sense Research Foundation, which is designed to bring aging under comprehensive medical control. And I will give, of course, a certain amount of background for how we are approaching this problem, but I will also spend some time on recent updates, on a description of where the field stands right now and what the next challenges are to bring this to completion. So I'm going to start by describing the nature of the problem, which is, of course, that there is an epidemic of the health problems of late life. And that epidemic is of our own making. It is a consequence of an enormous success, namely our success in defeating the infectious diseases that used to kill so many people early in life. Of course, when I say that infectious diseases have been defeated, I am oversimplifying somewhat because, first of all, in the developing world, we still have some way to go to bring infectious diseases such as malaria under real control. And secondly, as we know, there are a few infections which are very difficult to control even with Western medicine. But despite that, we are certainly seeing a virtually negligible quantity of infections and deaths from the main infectious diseases that used to kill people in infancy and in childbirth 200 years ago maybe. Things like tuberculosis and diphtheria. And the graph I'm showing you on this slide is just one way to illustrate that. As an example, I'm using statistics from the USA, but any industrialized country would look pretty much the same. And here I'm simply showing the percentage of the population in the USA that is over the age of 65. It's been going up and up, and it's going to carry on going up. The result is, of course, that we have a lot more people suffering from the health problems of late life. And perhaps the biggest difference between those problems and infectious diseases of early life is that the late life health problems that we see so much of today are progressive and gradual, which means that people stay alive but sick for a long time before they die. So that means, apart from anything else, that these health problems are insanely expensive. Here again, just for illustration, I am showing you statistics from the USA, but again, it would be just the same whatever country you look at across the whole industrialized world. The red line is the growth of the US economy during a 50-year period starting in 1960 and going through to 2010. And the blue line is the growth during the same period of expenditure on healthcare in the USA. Looked at in that way, it doesn't seem particularly scary. And, but if you divide the red line by the blue line, then it's terrifying. What you get is the green line, of course, which is the trajectory of the proportion of the US economy spent on medical care. And in just 50 years, that percentage more than trebled. It went up from 5% to about 18%. And this is, of course, why people say that the health insurance industry and health insurance measures in the US are going to go bankrupt quite soon. And again, it's not very different in other developed countries. So, what does this mean? Well, one thing it means is that it helps me to get you to believe what I'm saying on this slide. A lot of people write about me and my work and our work in the media. And, the media like to be sensationalist. So they like to call me the prophet of immortality and things like that. But I don't work on immortality. I don't even work on longevity. And the reason I don't is basically illustrated by what I just told you. We cannot keep people alive for a long, long time in a poor state of health, even if we wanted to. And of course, we don't want to. What we want to do is keep people healthy for a long time. And if we do, there will be a side effect, namely that people will, on average, live a long time. Stands to reason, right? Because most people die from being sick. So if we allow you not to get sick, we will allow you not to die. So, the question then is, so what? Well, unfortunately, the thing is that people get terribly, terribly exercised by the fact that the magnitude of this side effect may be really rather great, may be really rather large compared to the magnitude of the longevity side effect of medicines that we have developed already. Now, we are proud to say that this is a good side effect, that anybody who is healthy is likely to want to carry on living and is entitled to carry on living, however long ago they were born. So we are not ashamed of this, but still, it's a side effect. We work on health. The reason why I think this is so hard to get across to people is that today, in today's world, when we don't have significant medicines against the health problems of late life, we have a trade-off between health and longevity, between, if you like, quality and quantity. There are lots of things that people enjoy doing that are bad for them. And that, makes people think that longevity is something that you can only get by sacrifice of some kind. But when we have medicines that actually tackle aging properly, that won't be like that. That's why I've put the word versus in quotes in the title of this slide. Health will no longer compete with longevity in the future. Health will confer longevity, and that is what we must always remember. A lot of the reason why I have spent so long, making that point so clear is because I have to spend so much of my time when I'm out there, in the media especially, contending with the questions, the concerns that I'm listing on the left-hand side of this slide. People constantly say, oh dear, where will we put all the people if we don't have aging anymore? Or they'll say, won't it be only for the rich? Or won't dictators live forever? Or won't it be boring? Or how will we pay the pensions? Or doesn't death give meaning to life? And it will not surprise you to learn that I am frustrated by these questions. Not so much by the fact that people ask them, but by the fact that people are so unwilling to listen to the answers. The answers to these questions are very easy. And in fact, the most powerful answer is the answer that I've already given. The answer is, it's actually all about health. And if you are telling me that we shouldn't try to bring aging under medical control because of this or that problem that we might create as a result, then you're going to have to tell me why you think that those problems we might create would be even worse than the problem we have today. I've already emphasized the economic magnitude of that problem. I don't think I need to emphasize the humanitarian magnitude. Aging is by far the number one cause of suffering in today's world. And as such, we have an absolutely clear moral obligation to bring it to an end as soon as we possibly can. All right, that's enough moralizing. Let me now talk about biology. So, I believe that a large part of why it has taken us so long to come to terms with the problem of aging and to tackle it effectively is because we have not asked ourselves the right questions. I believe that the right question to begin with is the one that I have on this slide. What is so different about age-related health problems? Why have they been so resistant to control by medicine when we have been so successful against infectious diseases? And furthermore, we've been successful against infectious diseases for a very long time because really simple measures actually work. Just discovering and realizing that hygiene is a good idea saves the most insane number of lives. And of course, really simple medicines, vaccines, antibiotics, even mosquito nets, right? So, what's so different about aging? Well, I believe that the main reason why people don't ask that question enough is because they think they already know the answer. They think it's this. They think it's just that there are so many things that go wrong with us late in life. And of course, they go wrong at more or less the same time, which means that they interact and exacerbate each other. So most people think that it's just the sheer complexity of the problem that has overwhelmed the efforts of the medical profession to bring it under control. And I'm not going to try and argue that that is not part of the problem. Certainly it is part of the problem, but it's only part. The main thing is rather different. The main reason, I believe, why we have failed against aging is because we have defined it badly. If you ask most people this question, you ask them, in what ways can somebody be sick? Then the answer that almost everybody will give you will be something like what I'm showing you in this table here. They will say, well, okay, there's infections, communicable diseases, that's column 1. Then there's genetic diseases, ones that a small number of people are unlucky enough to inherit, that's number 2. Then there's the big one, column 3, the chronic progressive diseases of late life, such as Alzheimer's or almost all cancers or atherosclerosis, all of those things that I put up in unreadably small font on the previous slide. And then most people would say that way out in the stratosphere, there's this 4th category of ways to be sick called aging itself, which consists of these rather poorly defined phenomena like frailty, and which is completely different from diseases in most people's minds. It is kind of natural and inevitable and universal and just kind of implicitly off limits to medicine. That's why I've drawn that big thick black line. And what that leads to is a real problem, which I'll explain in a moment. In order to explain what's wrong with that mistake, and I'll explain what the mistake is in a second, I'm going to start by defining aging. Now, of course, most people think they have a perfectly good definition of aging in their heads. But if you actually ask people what aging is, if you ask 10 people, you'll get a hell of a lot of different answers. And that's not good. After all, it's pretty surprising, because aging has been the number 1 preoccupation of the human race since the beginning of civilization. But here we are, people will give different definitions. So here's my definition, and this is not just so that we're all on the same page during this talk. I'm also giving you this definition because it demystifies aging. It explains that aging is not some bizarre enigma that we totally don't understand. Aging is the combination of 2 processes. A process that goes on throughout life, literally starting before we're born, that's the one on the left, and a process that kicks off late in life. Now, the one on the left, the lifelong one, is the creation of damage by our metabolism. So metabolism is simply the word that biologists use to denote the entire network of processes that keep us alive from one day to the next. And of course that begins before we're born. And it creates side effects. It creates changes to the molecular and cellular structure and composition of the body. And those side effects accumulate over time. Now, the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of that change, and without any significant decline in function, either physical function or mental function. but it's only set up to tolerate a certain amount. And that's why it's appropriate to use the word damage to denote those changes. Eventually, there's too much of those changes for the body to tolerate, and that's when the right-hand process kicks off, a process whereby the damage initiates and exacerbates progressive pathologies of late life, which eventually kill us. That's all that aging is, those two processes. So that means something rather important about the classification I gave a moment ago. What it means is that we need to put the big, thick black line in a different place. Look at column 3 again. In what way is column 3 different from column 4? It's not different at all. Column 3 consists of health problems that are chronic and progressive and occur in late life, and they are intrinsic. They arise from changes that happen in the body throughout life rather than as a result of infections. Though, of course, it's possible that in some cases infections may exacerbate or accelerate them. That's completely like column 4, right? And it's completely unlike column 1. And that's why the approach of medicine today for separating metabolism from pathology is so misguided. After all, that's the goal, right? We want to separate metabolism from pathology. We want to allow people, someone is still talking. Okay. Metabolism, being alive is what we want people to carry on doing without exacerbating pathology. We want to separate metabolism from pathology. So today what we try to do is we try to separate them by separating damage from pathology, by interfering with the right-hand process. And it doesn't work. Obviously it doesn't work because the damage is continuing to accumulate throughout life. So anything that tries to prevent the consequences of damage is certain to become progressively less effective as the person gets older. It's just brain dead. It's just insane. But that's where almost all the money goes these days. Now, I'm not the first person to notice how brain dead this idea is. More than a century ago, a few people started to realize that this was just never going to get anywhere, and that we had to be more preventative if we really want to defeat aging with medicine. Rather than separating metabolism from pathology by separating damage from pathology, instead, we might well try separating metabolism from damage. And the inspiration for that is the living world. The fact that if we look across species, we see an enormous amount of variation in how long species live, how rapidly they generate damage as consequences of their metabolism. So the idea was, well, maybe if we study this variation really, really hard, we will eventually understand it well enough to be able to devise ways to make the human body run more cleanly and generate damage more slowly than it naturally does. Great idea in principle. Completely ineffective, absolutely hasn't given us anything, and here's why. This is the problem, it really is complexity. This is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body actually works, how our metabolism works. And, well, any of you who have ever written software will immediately see that this is the ultimate nightmare of uncommented spaghetti code. There is absolutely no way in God's earth that we're ever going to be able to tweak this system so as to stop it from doing the thing we don't want it to do, the creation of damage, without, at the same time, stopping it from doing things we need it to do to keep us alive. It's just not going to happen. But luckily there's a third approach. Coming back again to the goal, which is to separate metabolism from pathology, another way to do it would be to leave both of the component processes alone and instead separate those processes from each other. And that's what damage repair would do. You can call it maintenance, preventative maintenance. We go in and we periodically get rid of some, most, not necessarily all, of the damage that metabolism has already laid down, and by doing that, we postpone the age at which the damage is going to reach the threshold that makes us sick. That's what the maintenance approach is. And of course, you may think it's a little arrogant to call it the common sense approach, but it really is, because let's face it, we already do it successfully with simple man-made machines. If you go back to the definition of aging that I've given, you can see that it could equally well be used to define aging of a car or an aeroplane or any other machine. Any machine with moving parts does itself damage as a consequence of its normal operation, and eventually that damage causes problems. So look at this car. It's 100 years old. How? How did it get that way? Not because it was designed to last 100 years, it's just got really, really slow damage creation. No way. No, it's because of damage repair. It's because this car, which was designed to last maybe only 10 years, has been lucky enough to be owned by people who did really thorough, periodic, comprehensive, preventative maintenance on it. And it's working every bit as well as when it was built. So all we now have to do in order to determine whether this is the right way to go is to ask, well, okay, what is the damage that we need to repair in the human body? We don't have to understand very much about how the damage is generated, in the same way that a car mechanic does not need to understand the chemistry of rusting in order to get rid of the rust and stop the doors from falling off. And it turns out that even though metabolism is viciously complicated, and the pathologies of late life are also viciously complicated, nevertheless, the damage that comes between the two is not so complicated. Yes, there are lots and lots of different types of damage, but it turns out that we can classify them in a very useful way. So the classification that I like is the one I'm showing you on the left-hand side of this table. Various different types of damage that progressively accumulate over life as a side effect of normal metabolism. So why is this classification so useful? Because of the right-hand side of this table. Corresponding to each category of damage, there is a generic approach to actually doing maintenance, to doing the damage repair. So just for illustration, let me talk about the first one, cell loss. What is that? Cell loss is simply there's an organ in which cells die and they are not automatically replaced by the division of other cells. That's all it is, okay? If that happens, then of course the number of cells goes down over time and eventually the organ does not have enough cells to do its job. How do we fix it? You all know. We fix it using stem cells. We generate cells in the laboratory, we get them into the right state to be the right sort of stem cell so that we can then inject them, and they will divide and differentiate to replace the cells that the body is not replacing on its own. That's all. That's all it is. Now, you think I'm oversimplifying? Not really, because yes, it's true that stem cell therapy is very complicated, and yes, it's also true that different organs need different stem cell therapies. But think about that a bit harder. The thing is, even though different stem cell therapies are different, they also have a lot in common. So realistically, once you've got one or two stem cell therapies working in one or two tissues, even though that may take a while, getting the next one working and the one after that will be far easier and faster. And that's really the logic that underpins the classification here. That's the motivation for it. Now, you may ask, well, okay, how hard is this? Are we getting there? We sure are. Let me talk about Parkinson's disease, just for illustration. It's a good example. Parkinson's disease is caused by the loss of a particular type of brain cell called a dopaminergic neuron. And these neurons live in a very specific part of the brain called the substantia nigra. Now, those cells happen to do a lot of work. They are highly energetic, and for that reason, they die more rapidly than most neurons do. And by old age, we've all lost maybe a quarter of the dopaminergic neurons we had early in life. Some people, of course, everything in aging happens at slightly different rates in different people. Some people are unlucky and they lose maybe 3/4 of their dopaminergic neurons, and those people get Parkinson's disease. What are we doing? We're trying stem cell therapy. was first tried 30 years ago, and even though back then we didn't know anything about how to manipulate stem cells in the laboratory before we inject them, even despite that, it was occasionally successful. And when it was successful, it was fantastically successful, like people having no symptoms of Parkinsonism, at least none of the dyskinesia, for like more than a decade after a single stem cell treatment, even though they were not on any other medication. It was just crazily effective. And now that we do know so much more about how to manipulate stem cells, people are very excited about going back and doing this again. And indeed, there's already one clinical trial well underway in Japan to do exactly this. There are a couple of other clinical trials about to start up, so people are pretty excited. In this talk, I don't really have time to go through all of the other categories, but happy to answer questions about them later on. So, first thing I want to explain is that this is no longer a radical, heretical idea. When I first put it forward 20 years ago, it took me quite a lot of effort to get people to understand what I was saying and that it wasn't crazy. But after about 10 years, that was all over. And this is now very... The figures I'm showing you here are from a paper that came out 11 years after my paper, if I'm not mistaken. And it's saying exactly the same thing as I said. They've chosen to divide aging into 9 categories instead of 7, but it's not that they thought of something I'd overlooked. It's just exactly the same idea. And this has become by far the most highly cited paper in the whole of the biology of aging in the past decade. This is the paradigm now. So that's quite gratifying. I don't have to justify this way of thinking to my colleagues in the biology of aging anymore. Moreover, we've made plenty of other progress. I set up Sense Research Foundation as a non-profit funded by philanthropy because I wanted to work on areas of damage repair that are really difficult, the most difficult ones, that are simply neglected by mainstream academia as well as by industry because they're too hard. There is enormous pressure to be short-termist in academia as well as in industry. In industry, of course, it's to do with profits. In academia, it's to do with promotions and grant applications. And so really difficult things are just never worked on, even though the scientists know they should. And we've been fixing that. This I'm writing here is just a few of the papers we've published over the past several years. I've picked out these ones just because they are particularly groundbreaking ones that really unlocked an entire area of research and made it not look so hard after all. So this has started a lot of other people working in this area, which has definitely been our goal. In fact, over the past 5 years, things have been even better than that. We have been able to expand our work into the private sector. What we've done is we've been in intensive conversations with investors over many years. These investors typically are the more courageous ones, the ones who are comfortable with high risk, high reward opportunities. And the result is that we've been able to spin out 6 of our projects into startup companies that, of course, have been much better funded than the projects were when we were funding them, simply because investors tend to write bigger checks than donors do. So this is all very encouraging, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's important, very important to let you know that there are now hundreds of companies out there doing closely aligned work, doing damage repair related work of one sort or another, and the reason this is growing so exponentially is, of course, because the available money is also growing exponentially. We have more and more investors of every kind, including institutional investors and venture funds and so on, coming into this space and driving it faster and faster. So this is a very gratifying time to be involved in this field. Now, I just want to talk a little bit more about that, though, because I've been a thought leader in this space for a long time, and I've been the single most outspoken one, I guess, for a long time, saying what we can really achieve. My colleagues who have to worry about getting their next grant application funded and not being accused of being irresponsible those people have been a good deal more cautious in their projections, but they're becoming less cautious now. For example, my friend David Sinclair, who's another very prominent thought leader in this field, wrote a book 2 years ago whose title was Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to. That's the kind of thing we need more of, and we're getting more of it all the time. We need, I believe, to get out there and take the risk, the political risk, of telling the truth about what is likely to happen and how soon. Of course, that is also very strongly helped by the pandemic. People don't often think about COVID-19 as a lifesaver, but they should and they will, because what COVID has done is it has woken up the policymakers and decision makers of the world to the understanding of how damaging aging is, not just in terms of suffering, but in terms of finances. And we have seen that the younger generation are sufficiently conscious of their duty to the older generation that they have put up with, really severe constraints on their way of life for the last 18 months. The economic cost of future pandemics, of course, is very heavily on the minds of decision makers and policy makers, and that economic cost can be reduced most effectively by accelerating the research that's going on right now to keep chronologically old people biologically young. We can especially do this in relation to the immune system. There's already been early stage clinical trials showing very effective rejuvenation of the immune system, and that work needs to accelerate drastically. So I'll stop there to answer questions, but I will just say that I wrote this book several years ago now, 14 years ago actually, talking about what I've told you today. You may think, well, if it's that old, it must be rather out of date and irrelevant, but no, and this is a really good thing. Even though there has been so much progress over that period of time, nevertheless, I don't really need to write a new book, because the progress that has been made has been pretty much exactly the progress that we predicted would be made. It's happened a bit more slowly than I was hoping, but it's definitely the same progress. In other words, the damage repair paradigm, this 7-point plan, is standing the test of time, which of course is pretty good evidence that we're on the right track. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aubrey, for this very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. I think I give also others, I think, permission so that they can unmute themselves, I think, now, if they have questions. But before that, before anyone asking a question, I have one question, actually two questions, but I will start with the first one, which is a little bit, I think, on a cultural, also social dimension of aging. Of course, we can discuss it. We can discuss aging and longevity in more kind of scientific discussion. But I was thinking, how can we attract a younger generation to be involved in this movement? Because I feel, I mean, as I was researching, first of all, as I was developing this initiative, what I found is that a lot of scientists that are basically involved in this, I don't know, Francis. I'm gonna.
No, I can speak.
Okay, perfect. A lot of scientists that are, but I just ask you to unmute so that there is no sound. The majority of scientists and prominent thought leaders in the field are, well, basically quite prominent and senior scientists, and I haven't seen much younger generation really discussing about longevity, even though that I think from the 7 stages of 7 layers of aging and 7 dimension, I felt that actually we can do a lot about them to prevent and to do this damage repair paradigm, and actively apply them in our lives as we are young. So we can basically do this paradigm like a lifestyle, like a mindset. So I was wondering to hear your thoughts How can we involve younger generation?
Yeah, so actually the situation is much better than you are describing it. The younger generation is really coming along into this movement right now. I think a large part of that is actually because they are young. And since they are young, they have been brought up from childhood to understand that aging is a medical problem. They have never had to change their minds. They didn't start out being brainwashed into believing the mistakes that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, that aging is some kind of blessing in disguise, or that it's natural and inevitable and off limits to medicine. They have actually understood. I mean, one of our biggest donors right now is Vitalik Buterin, who created Ethereum, the cryptocurrency. He read my book when he was 14. He he always knew that this was the thing to do. And when he got into a position where he was able to make a difference by making a donation, he came along and did so. And he's not the only one by any means. There are more and more people of that kind of generation, people in their 20s, who are getting heavily involved. Another person I should probably mention is Laura Deming, who understood from the age of, I think she says 8, that she wanted to work on aging. And she ended up, after a very rapid and precocious education, creating the world's first longevity-specific venture fund back in, I think, 2014, when she was still a teenager. She's now an enormously important influencer in the field, as well as, of course, running a fund. That's just a couple of examples. So people are coming along really fast. Now, of course, in the scientific field, it takes time to train, to get the knowledge and the skills to be a thought-leading scientist. So you wouldn't expect too many people in their 20s to be making a big difference in that way. But that's fine. If I can, and the more activists I can recruit from the younger generation, whether they are contributing by making big donations or small donations, whether they are contributing by advocacy, whether they're contributing by political activism. I've got one friend of that generation who is very involved in lobbying in Washington, D.C., for example. So lots of people are in this movement now, and a lot of them are in the younger generation.
Thank you very much. So basically there are younger people from private sector, shall I say, that they're doing, I think, involving in this research. And my second question is that, given that there are these 7 clear pathways that you mentioned in your presentation, are there any also longevity related checkup plans? So that's like an annual checkup, or are there any also programs that people can actually follow, or are there any strategies that are developed?
So let me answer that question in 2 different ways. Firstly, with regard to the present day, and secondly, with regard to the future when these therapies exist. In the present day, of course, there are the kinds of checkups that everybody always does to check on their health, but there's nothing particularly special. There's not really a good way yet to help yourself to live longer with medicines or lifestyle or diet that exists today. Not appreciably longer anyway. Of course, I'm generalizing here. Some people may have some particular thing wrong with their metabolism that will be something we can fix with existing medicine or existing diets or supplements or whatever. But for most people, there is not a significant amount that we can do over and above just doing the way living the way your mother told you to, really. Not smoking, not getting seriously overweight, and so on. Now, in the future, when these medicines exist, your question becomes a different one. Your question becomes, what should people do to essentially know what medicines to take and when? But actually, I have a feeling there won't be much of that. We do, of course, have a very strong focus these days on personalized medicine, on identifying how to optimize. But you only really need personalized medicine when the generic medicine doesn't work very well. In other words, when you have to optimize it. Like we don't have personalized polio vaccines because like it just works, right? And so personalized medicine always needs to be remembered where it's kind of a stopgap. Now, what that means for aging is we need to look at the differences between people. And, well, yes, different people die of different types of age related problem. And that's largely because different people accumulate different types of damage at different rates. But not massively different rates, just slightly different, which means everyone's got the same kinds of damage. So it may end up being more cost effective to actually just treat everybody the same without bothering to do much diagnosis. The worst that's going to happen then is some people are going to get certain therapies twice as often as they need them. But it's just preventative maintenance, right? So that's kind of probably going to be okay.
Okay, thank you very much for this answer. I think I see there are questions in the chat box. I don't know, Clément, if you want to ask the questions yourself or shall I read them? Do let me know.
Yes, I can ask. Sorry for the background. Thank you very much for this presentation.
Clément, maybe it would be better if I read the question so that you can stay on mute and you're...
Yes.
Okay, so the question is, are there lifelong trial studies in progress that actively fight the 7 deadly things? And the answer is there are some. So I mentioned one during my talk, which is a clinical trial against Parkinson's disease. Now, the only word that is incorrect in what you just said is lifelong. And this is important to remember. These are rejuvenation therapies. They are damage repair therapies, which means that it makes actually not much sense to give them to people who are really young. The ideal patient is someone who is in middle age. They're not yet sick, but they've got plenty of damage that's there that can be repaired. So, that's happening. Then there are also clinical trials for one of the other areas, namely the elimination of senescent cells, which I usually call death-resistant cells. There have been clinical trials for that in relation to osteoarthritis, and also there are trials going on against glaucoma. There are other trials coming quite soon. Several of the other strands are quite close to clinical trials, and I'm hopeful, certainly, that they will be in clinical trials within the next year or two. Of course, what matters in the end, though, is to apply these therapies in combination so that we are fixing multiple types of damage by applying multiple damage repair approaches to the same people at the same time. And that is still a little way off. Then your second question, Clément, is what do you think of hormesis and how much of it should we do, e.g., small bad challenges like taking a bit of alcohol? Well, hormesis is a very generic and reasonable concept. So for those of you in the audience who don't know that word, what it's all about is giving the body a small challenge that is not all that bad for you, and giving that challenge for a short time. The result is that the defenses of the body against the challenge, whether it's an infection or high temperature or something like that, the defenses against this are elevated relative to where they were before the challenge. And when you remove the challenge, the defenses remain elevated, at least for some time. So that means that the defenses are essentially working harder against the normal basal level of challenge. And there is evidence that in certain cases that can cause a modest extension of longevity in model organisms. However, I honestly think that it's quite unlikely to give any significant longevity benefits in most people. I think that, yes, there is a kind of a principle of use it or lose it. So, exercise is good for you. Different people need different amounts of exercise in order to stay fit, but it definitely makes sense to maintain a relatively low % fat in your body, for example. but that's not really an example of hormesis.
Yes, please, Francis.
To pick up in this idea of hormesis, I have myself proposed a strategy against aging. I'm not a medical doctor, but I'm a complexity scientist that I call the buffering challenging strategy. And the idea is that the body is made to save resources if it doesn't need to use them. So if you want it to use all its resources to combat damage, that means to repair damage, on the one hand, you should have enough of these resources. That's what I call the buffering. You should have good results of all the minerals, nutrients, vitamins, proteins, etc. On the other hand, you should challenge the body to use these resources, and that you do by things such as exercises and also things like saunas, cold baths, yoga. There are all kinds of different techniques, which I think each of them will challenge a different kind of body system. And there, my idea is the wider the variety of challenges you do, the more different things the body will try out to correct. And for example, with heat, when you take a sauna, the body will produce heat shock proteins, which are known also to repair some of the damage. So what do you think about that kind of strategy?
Yeah, that is basically the hormesis argument, and as I say, it's not wrong. I just don't think it's very beneficial. So, for example, you're quite right. I think the heat shock example is probably the simplest example of hormesis. It's very true. Heat shock proteins are chaperone proteins. In other words, they help to maintain the correct folding of other proteins, for example. They reduce the amount of damage that the body has, and the amount of certain types of damage, and therefore the more heat shock proteins you have, the better in some sense. And the body normally makes a kind of compromise and says, well, okay, I need a certain amount of heat shock proteins in order to keep the level of damage acceptable, and therefore I won't make any more because it takes energy to make a protein, including a heat shock protein, and therefore it makes sense to not use that energy on unnecessarily abundant heat shock proteins. So yes, absolutely. And indeed, another example which certainly does extend longevity in model organisms is calorie restriction, which causes, among other things, an increase in the rate of turnover of damaged proteins in cells, increase in something called autophagy. So yeah, all of this is true. It's just I don't think it's going to give us very much benefit in practice. Certainly nothing like what we could get by doing explicit damage repair with medicine.
While you were presenting your, I think the very first slides about how actually economic damage is done globally because of aging, I was thinking, should we kind of move toward this idea that longevity in a sense of not immortality, but longevity in a sense of being able to live as healthy as possible as a human right? Or shall we have some kinds of declaration of human rights about longevity?
So, of course, in principle, I certainly think that that's the case. I think that neglect of research to combat aging with medicine is the most extreme example of ageism, of declaring that people who were born a long time ago are somehow less important than people who were born recently. I think it's absolutely terrifying how much we neglect that. But realistically, the reason we are so complacent and why we disregard the elderly is easy to identify. The reason we do it is because the elderly don't complain enough. Aging is unique, really, among all campaigns, all humanitarian efforts, in that its victims don't complain enough. Because aging is so slow, people kind of get used to it and they just, they lose energy and they become resigned to their fate. And if you ask a typical elderly person, where should medical resources and medical research go? They'll say, oh, give it to the young. They've got more to gain. Which, I mean, it doesn't take very much time to explain to people that that's actually a completely circular argument, that the whole point is to give the elderly more to gain. But, getting that argument to be actually accepted is very hard.
At the same time, I think, apologies, Maris, I know that you want to share something. At the same time, I think it's really when we age and when we arrive to a certain point that we kind of develop wisdom and we're able to contribute to society. So it's not really about chronological age, it's also about how much wisdom we collect throughout our lives and how can we actually, it becomes part of our cultural and I think human biodiversity reservoir, I feel like, that I think all the people, they have wisdom, they have seen more, so we can kind of bridge the gap between different generations with that longevity.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, and again, this argument is not new. People have been trying to say this for a long time, that whenever somebody dies, somebody old especially, then we are losing an enormous repository of wisdom. And I also think that when people who are chronologically old are all biologically young, that it will be much easier to have better communication between generations, which of course will also help collective wisdom, among other things.
Yes, Marius, I know that you.
Yes, okay. I have a comment.
Hey.
More in the clinical sense. I see a big problem with translation of laboratory results to clinical medicine. You mentioned earlier something about CLEA and Revel. Are they names of companies or names of treatments, therapies?
They're names of companies. CLEA is the company that is pursuing a bacterial enzymatic approach for eliminating the waste products in the retina in macular degeneration. And Revel is a company pursuing the cleavage, the breaking of the chemical bonds formed by glycation, by non-enzymatic glycosylation in tissues, including the major arteries, so as to address hypertension, among other things.
Yes, but is this successful, at least with the breaking of the crosslinks? Because
both of those approaches are showing sufficient success that investors think they're going to work. That's why they are companies and no longer need to be pursued within Sense Research Foundation. However, at this point, neither of them is in clinical trials yet, but that should be within the next year or two, I would hope.
I was thinking on investing in Altion or ALT-711, and that went belly up. But my comment is that you have now, you've been trying with Sense for over 20, 25 years, and you haven't seen any actual results, any drugs or treatments or therapies. Don't you think your approach may be wrong?
I don't think so, no. I think that the message of those past 20 years has been very encouraging, that progress has accelerated. And of course, it's not just in my own mind that progress has accelerated. We've had an accelerating number of academic publications. We've had, as I say, an accelerating number of investors getting interested. And these are not just, naive investors. These are people who have made very good money in other sectors over the years and have a great reputation for not throwing their money away. And of course, it's also the case that, as I mentioned, the Sense approach, the damage repair approach, has become extremely mainstream in the gerontology community, with the restatement of it and in terms of hallmarks, among other things. So no, I think everything's extremely encouraging. Now, of course, I do want to emphasize that the time frame for eventually getting to the finish line, so to speak, for having a really decisively comprehensive panel of damage repair interventions, that time frame is still extremely uncertain. I think there's a 50% chance that we will get there within 15 years from now, but as I've always said, I still say that there's at least a 10% chance that we won't get there for 100 years because of unforeseen obstacles that we encounter. We all know that fundamental breakthroughs like this, you don't know how long they're going to be. Lord Kelvin was very wrong when he said in 1900 that powered flight was impossible, and he wasn't the only credentialed physicist saying so. But equally, Leonardo da Vinci probably didn't think it was going to take 400 years to get his designs to actually work. So you never know.
Okay, so we'll wait and see, because I remember on 9/11 we were having a beer, and that was what, 2001, and discussing these things. So yes, there are many investors and many companies, but I'm interested in real patients now, real people. They keep asking me all the time, is there something apart from vitamins? We need something.
They ask me too, and you and I are side by side on that. We definitely want something, and I believe that diversity of approach, trying everything that might work, is the best approach, the best strategy for making something actually work as soon as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aubrey. I see Karin, you're raising hand. You can, I think, unmute yourself and ask a question. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I will. Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes,
We can hear you.
Very well.
Loud and
Thank you for this interesting presentation and discussion. I just want to ask a question which relates maybe a little bit to what the last person asked as well. Already with the present state of medicine, etc., the expectation of life has been elongated over the past, say, 50 years spectacularly. I don't expect it will continue to grow in that sense in the near future, but there is still a lot of space for adding to that. But we see that at the present moment, the growth in longevity for many people is inaccessible. This is the case evidently in many countries which are poor and denied the access to proper medical assistance and proper other caretaking facilities like sports or healthy food or things like that. So people die way longer before the time that they even now could expect to live in many countries. And even with us, people on the lower range of income in our country, for instance, can have 20 to 25 years less of life expectancy than people in the higher range. What is your reaction to that state of affairs? And don't you think that we should focus maybe first on that before we elongate the life of others even more for a very limited, certainly very limited group at the first instance? Voilà.
So I come to a very different conclusion from you. First of all, I do want to say that the statistics need to be looked at carefully. Yes, it is certainly true that there is an utterly unacceptable amount of inequality within many countries, within pretty much all countries, in relation to medical care and life expectancy. However, if we look across the world, things are actually improving at an astonishing rate. Not a lot of people seem to have noticed this, but for the past 5 years or so, according to the World Health Organization, there hasn't been a single country in the whole world that has an average lifespan of less than 50. And if we exclude sub-Saharan Africa, there isn't a single country in the whole world that has a lifespan less than 60. So the developing world is catching up really fast. In fact, if we look at the whole world added together, and we ask what is the average longevity, it's now touching 73. So, it's less than 10 years behind the longest lived countries. That's a big deal, and it's something that shouldn't be forgotten. However, saying all that, I completely agree with you that within countries, the level of inequality is absolutely unacceptable. However, I come to a very different conclusion when I look at how we might fix it and what we should do. I absolutely do not think that the way to fix it is to work on inequality, because inequality is the main, it's a function of societal attitudes. It's not something that can just be changed by throwing money at it. Whereas technology is something that can be changed by throwing money at it. The key point here is that at the moment, getting old does not necessarily mean having a high quality life. As we know, the longer you live, the sicker you get. And most people end up spending a long period of time in a declining and diminished state of health, both mentally and physically. So the public pressure, the public enthusiasm for getting more people to live longer is simply not very great right now. And I believe that that is why there remains so much inequality in pretty much all countries. Whereas, if we could create therapies that would allow a long life to be a truly fulfilling, vigorous, youthful life, then I believe that the public pressure to ensure that everybody can access that healthy life, however wealthy or unwealthy they are, that pressure would be completely different from what it is today.
Thank you very much, Karin, for your question. Thank you, Aubrey, for this answer. I see Jared. I know that you were asking you wanted to ask a question. Please ask your question.
Well, it is a technical question. You were mentioning that you were using probabilistic concepts as the only one in the field, and I wondered why and in what sense you do. I would say that health is a deterministic type of phenomenon.
I'm not sure I understand the question, or perhaps you misunderstood what I said. The only thing I mentioned about probabilities was my subjective estimate of the probability of reaching a certain amount of comprehensiveness of these therapies in a certain amount of time. So, I don't think that really relates to anything to do with what you just asked. Maybe we just misunderstood each other.
Then I misunderstood.
I see Derek, you wanted to ask a question, and then after that, Francis, I see that you're raising your hand as well. Derek, please ask your question.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for this very interesting talk. I have a question which was not touched a little bit, but not directly, I think. What is your idea? And I know that Shima is interested in that also from earlier meetings we had. What is your idea that the kind of psychologically meaningfulness of life could influence quite straightly also the health and the longevity? So we once thought of the example of Stephen Hawking, of course, who was living very long with a disease that would kill people in a few years usually.
So I'm quite sure that having a fulfilling life, a life where one feels one has a purpose, is an enormous factor for one's mental health, and that one's mental health, one's ability to manage stress or to avoid stress, has big knock-on effects on physical health. So absolutely, there is definitely a big, if you like, a mind-body connection. Of course, there are many ways to minimize one's stress, whether it's to avoid stressful situations, whether it's to become good at meditation or such like. But for sure, the approach that you just mentioned, making sure that one has a fulfilling life with meaning, is a big part of that. So I completely agree.
Thank you. And is there kind of evidence for that? You have looked at, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's understood that there are certain hormones, stress hormones, like cortisol, which are elevated, of course, when one is in a stressful situation. And these hormones they go all over the body. That's what hormones do. And they accelerate the creation and accumulation of certain types of damage. So yes, I mean, of course, like so much in biology, we don't understand it all in all its detail, but broadly that is understood, yes.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, Francis, can you hear me?
There he goes.
There you go.
Hello, okay. Yeah, I wanted to continue this line of thought with meaningfulness. The motivation that Shima and I had when we thought of making this research group, which was then called Longevity Plus, is that it's not just about longevity, but it's about well-being. And my idea is that well-being, both in the physical and in the mental sense, goes together with longevity, because well-being means your body and mind are functioning the way they should, which means they will be less stressed, which means they will accumulate less damage, and vice versa. If you accumulate less damage, then you will feel better. So to me, longevity and well-being are two sides of the same coin. And I think that may be also one of the arguments to convince people to invest in it, because nowadays everybody agrees that well-being is very important. And especially now with the pandemic, lots of people suffered from stress even when they didn't get ill. And if you can have a strategy that increases well-being, then it will also increase longevity and vice versa.
Completely correct. I could not agree more. That's absolutely correct. It was the same thing that I was trying to say in one of my slides where I explained that longevity and health are not a trade-off. They're not in conflict. Rather, health is what confers longevity. So this is, yeah, you're saying it in a very good way.
I wanted to read Clément's question. Thank you, Francis, for your question. I also have a question myself after Clément's question. What are your personal practices, practical strategies against aging that you would recommend we all apply?
Yeah, I get asked this a lot. I honestly don't have any. And this is, but I do want to emphasize that I am not suggesting that nobody should have any, not at all. The reason I don't have any is because I am lucky. I have just built well. Over the past 20 years, I have had my biological age tested half a dozen times in various different ways, and I always come out ridiculously young, like way more than a decade younger than I really am. So for me, the rational thing to do is not to change anything, to take the attitude that if it isn't broken, you shouldn't try to fix it. And of course, that is not going to be true forever. So I do pay close attention to my health. But in terms of how I actually act, what I eat, what I drink, and so on, I am doing the same as I have all my life. Some people, everyone really, should pay attention to their bodies and do what works. If you are not feeling good, then you're doing something wrong. But if you are feeling good and you have energy and everything seems to be going well, then you need to take that into account as well.
Thank you very much for sharing your answer. I actually, my question is kind of connected to what you said. You said I am built well. So while you were presenting, I was thinking about this metaphor of a car that you shared about the machine. And I was wondering that have you ever been kind of criticized for a kind of mechanical point of view on the body? Because I don't think that the body can be formulated as a machine. For example, if an organ or a part of our body kind of fails, we cannot go and replace it as easily as we can. For example, if a tire fails of our car. So I think the metaphor of a car might be, or a machine in particular, I think it's more of a. I just have this question. It might not be a correct question. That would it create resistance? And can we think about our bodies as kind of like monument, like Persepolis or Duomo in Milan, because it's like 100 years old, were there designers thinking that this can survive the test of time?
Yeah, certainly some people have suggested that this metaphor is oversimplistic, the car metaphor. However, I think it's really useful, much more useful than describing the human body as a monument, which doesn't have even moving parts or anything. The reason I think it's actually a good metaphor is because the things that do distinguish a normal, simple man-made machine from a living organism are actually good things for the prospects of developing medicines. First of all, yes, of course, the human body is enormously more complicated than a simple man-made machine. And of course, also, we don't have the plans, the blueprints. So, that makes it harder still. But that's just a difference of degree. So you were saying, yes, we can replace the tires on the car. Well, of course, we can also replace a liver with a liver transplant. Even with the brain, we can replace individual cells. As I mentioned, in Parkinson's disease, this is already happening in clinical trials. So, I think that's a difference of degree, a quantitative difference, rather than a qualitative one. Perhaps the more important thing is, people will often say, well, look, the human body repairs itself, right? It's got this really good damage repair mechanisms, and they just stop working late in life. And of course, that's true, but if we ask why do they stop working or why do they work less well late in life, the answer is because of the accumulation of damage that these damage repair mechanisms did not work on even early in life, right? So actually, it's just like a machine. And furthermore, the damage repair mechanisms that we already have that are built in that are natural, they are on our side, so to speak. So all we have to do is fill in the gaps that evolution has left, the little bits of damage that accumulate so slowly that evolution has not taken the trouble to figure out a way to fix them. So really the analogy is very strong, and it tells us that this all makes sense.
In terms of replacing, for example, liver transplants and other therapies, then could it be also an option of moving toward democratization of accessibility of these therapies? Because if the metaphor is very strong, then is it accessible to a lot of people, or
Well,
just?
Sure. I mean, at the moment, of course, something like an organ transplant, it's very expensive, and it's only needed by a few people, by a relatively small minority of people, at least only if we include people who are going to be able to survive a transplant. If someone is, very old and frail, and they need a new liver, they probably can't actually withstand the surgery in the first place. So that's kind of not the thing to do. But the democratization of these therapies when they come along, when they are comprehensive, is essential. And I believe that it will be immediate. We won't have any delay when it's only for the rich. The reason we won't is simply because, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, aging is so ridiculously expensive, right? It costs us so much money to keep people alive in a poor state of health. So these therapies will pay for themselves at the national level insanely rapidly. As such, it will be, even if we forget completely about the humanitarian imperative, or the electoral imperative for that matter, just the economic imperative to ensure that everybody who is old enough to need these therapies can get them, that is completely decisive.
Great, thank you very much. Francis, please ask your question. Okay.
Well, I want to make maybe a little bit more technical remark in the comparison between mechanisms and organisms. So an organism is very complex. One of the things we know about complex systems is that they are non-linear. They are different mechanism that the one works onto the other. In a car, these things are relatively separate. You can change the tires and you can clean up the motor and you can change the oil. Those things are pretty independent. In the body, they are very dependent, and I think that may explain the so-called Gompert's law, which says that after a certain age, the probability of dying increases exponentially. Because if it was just a slow down deterioration, like with a car, there wouldn't be this sudden exponential falling apart of the car after a certain age. It's as if a car after 10 years, all cars within 10 and 12 years would fall apart.
Yeah, totally. So let me briefly just mention in relation to the Gompert's relationship. The only real thing that's wrong with your logic there is that lots of other types of assumption also lead to a Gompert's relationship. For example, you can get exactly the same thing if you simply have a system with a lot of redundancy, even if it does not have any crosstalk between systems. It's not very. It doesn't really tell us very much to notice that the Gompert's equation exists. However, to come back to your initial point about crosstalk, absolutely, the crosstalk in the body is enormous, and it's a big difference between organisms and machines. But again, it's a good difference because there is also crosstalk between the damage repair processes that we naturally have. And actually, I think you're giving me the opportunity to highlight one of the biggest, best surprises that I have had over the past 10 years or so in this field. When people started to figure out ways to remove senescent cells from model organisms, from mice, it was seen that the benefits for health were very much more wide-ranging than anyone really would have expected. And essentially, this is because of exactly what you say, because of the crosstalk between the different types of damage and the types of damage repair. I always knew that there would be crosstalk, but I underestimated the magnitude of the crosstalk.
Okay, I don't know if anybody has another question, so please raise your hand if you want to ask question. If not, I have a question myself. I was wondering if you could share a little bit, I mean, again, there's a question out of curiosity that came to my mind, is that regarding those 7 layers of paying attention to aging and the research that is needed to be done on longevity, have you ever done any geographical mapping on which part of the world is more vulnerable in those 7 areas? And
there's basically no difference. There is, it's just, if you're a human being, you're going to accumulate all of these types of damage at more or less the same rate. Of course, there will be slight differences. Different diets may lead to different incidence of cancer, things like that. But this doesn't really make any difference to the therapies themselves. We will still be applying all the therapies to all the people.
And your research, have you also done a collaboration with the information theory of aging of David Sinclair that he provides?
Okay, let me talk briefly about that. So David has kind of been a bit, well, I think he's gone out a little bit too far on a limb there, quite honestly. David and I, of course, we've been good friends for 20 years, so, I understand where he's coming from, but I think he's probably slightly oversold that idea at this point. Of course, he's working very hard to do the laboratory experiments to see whether he's right, but at this point, I think it's probably too strong to say that this particular mechanism of damage to the DNA is the real, the nexus of everything.
Thank you. Clément's question, what do you think about the promise of nanomedicine, overrated or underrated?
So, of course, it depends what you mean by nanomedicine. There are probably as many definitions of nanomedicine out there as there are of aging. But there are some aspects, the development of nanoparticles with particular properties that are really promising. Nanomedicine used to mean the development of atomically precise things of the size of enzymes or whatever that could do things that proteins can't do because they don't have the right atoms. And there's no progress at all in that, but also it hasn't been overrated. Nobody really expects there to be any progress in that area anytime soon. So, it depends what you mean by nanomedicine.
Okay, I don't know, Clema, if you want to clarify your definition or your understanding of nanomedicine, you're more than welcome. I see, Derek, you wanted to ask a question. Please go ahead. Derek, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I could not.
Yes, yes, please.
I could not unmute myself, actually. But
Okay.
let's say that it's a very general question and perhaps not so relevant. But I'm a physicist, not a biologist. But let's say that the real struggle is actually a struggle on the physics level. Let's say a struggle against the second law of thermodynamics, they say, the increase of entropy. So my question is whether you know of some research that would focus on that, because you see, it could be that could be a very global solution if one could have a detection system of where in the body the entropy increases. You see.
So people have been thinking this way for a long time, yes. And you're quite right. I mean, a very simple way to say it, a non-technical way to say it, is that the only reason that living organisms can exist at all is because they have developed very efficient ways of exporting entropy into the environment. Equally, the reason why we age is because mechanisms for exporting entropy are not perfect.
Yeah.
So you're quite right. We can, in a way, talk about about aging as being a phenomenon of physics and, indeed, a phenomenon of entropy. However, that doesn't really tell us anything we didn't already know, because we're already identifying the damage at the molecular and cellular level. The disorder, to put it in thermodynamic terms, that is accumulating. And therefore we know what additional entropy we need to export.
Okay, thank you.
Roland, I see that you've raised your hand. Apologies, I missed your question. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My question was, my question was, what kind of transformation would a given society has to experience to achieve a more than noticeable extension of its members' age, and by what means? Assuming aging is, considering all things, a global topic or question, so to speak.
So I don't think society does need to undergo any transformation in order to experience this. The reason I say that is because it is already universally agreed that being sick is undesirable, and being healthy is desirable. So that means once the technology arrives to allow more people to be healthy, that technology will be embraced. The energy, the mechanisms by which it will be embraced, already exist. As I mentioned earlier, I believe that the simple economic merits of doing so, and indeed the electoral imperative, the fact that it's possible to get elected less, these things, existing systems, will already cause this to happen. I don't think any transformation of society is required. What we do need, a transformation of society in a way, is right now, before the therapies arrive. We need to educate society and get them to think more objectively and rationally about the prospect of a post-aging world, in order that as these medicines arrive, they are used to the maximum benefit of humanity, so that there is the minimum amount of, let's call it, turbulence in the process, which might otherwise be different if people were taken by surprise when these therapies arrived. So I do a lot of talking now, both to scientists and also to policymakers and leaders of industry and so on, telling them, wake up. Do not just wait for these therapies to arrive. You need to be ready in advance so as to play your part, whether it's in order to make more money or whether it's in order to stay in power or anything.
Great, thank you very much, Aubrey, and also Roland, for your question. Speaking of policies, have you, is there any connection between nudge theory and choice architecture and these strategies that you mentioned at the level of policies? I don't know if you know about nudge theory, though. But nudge theory basically explains that you can design the space of choices for the society so that they can make, basically you increase the chances of better decisions. So if you want to, for example, one of the strategies that probably is connected to what Roland is asking is that can we design policies in such a way that promote longevity without really having this difficulty of convincing people that, longevity is important. So kind of automatic integration of longevity promoting policies.
Sounds good to me. I mean, I've been trying to encourage people like people who think about policy and decision making and politics and so on. I've been trying to encourage people like that to apply their expertise to this problem for a long time, and maybe it's happening a little bit more now. I mean, as I say, I've never heard of any of this, but if people who are expert in such thinking are listening to what I'm saying and seeing that this is an important application of that thinking, then that makes me very happy.
Yes, it's a book. It's called Nudge Theory by Cass Sunstein and Thaler. That it's been really largely, basically studied as a level of as a method of creating creative policies to change at the global level. I see, Clément, you have something in the chat. The second law, as long as it's maintained, body can harness new energy and reject entropy. It has no reason to die in this general sense. The second law allows, in principle, immortality, given external energy and a sink. Do you agree?
That is correct in the abstract, but in practice, the exporting of entropy is not just one process. It is a collection of processes that are targeting different types of entropy, different instances and structures of molecular and cellular disorder. And therefore, that's why we export most of the entropy that the body creates in the course of metabolism, but not all of it.
Well, thank you very much.
I'm going to have to go soon.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I know that also you're very busy and we really appreciate you accepting this invitation. I just wanted to ask you if you have any final thoughts to share. You're more than welcome.
I mean, really, my main final thought is I'm delighted to have been here and to have been able to speak to such a diverse audience. Obviously, I very much enjoyed all of the questions that I've received. And some of the ideas, especially this business about notch theory, which you just mentioned, are inspiring. I don't know whether I will have the time to educate myself so much on all of this, but if I can educate the people who already understand notch theory so that they get on and try and apply it to the problem of aging, then I will be extremely happy. So I want to thank you again for having me along.
Thank you very much, Aubrey. And for the final comment, if people want to approach you and find you, can you also share a little bit about your foundation? Please.
I put up on my final slide, I had my email address and the website of my foundation, sense.org. I'll type them in the chat as well, just for the hell of it. Yes, it is. And my email address. And yes, absolutely. I very much encourage people to visit the website. There's masses of information there for every kind of audience. And there's also a comment form where you can send us questions. We're very well behaved about answering questions that come in that way. And you could write to me personally at the email address I just put in the chat. And of course, there's a nice big friendly donate button. But yes, the website is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. I wish you a very beautiful evening. And with that said, I really appreciate all of you here. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.